and welcome to the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. I'm Leah Higl and I'm here with my co-host Aidan Muir, and today's episode we will be discussing macro ratios and why we don't often tend to use them. So a little bit of background here. Macro ratios are basically percentages of your total calorie intake. So macronutrients being protein, fats, and carbs contain calories, and you've probably seen things like macro targets or tracking macros before. And one way that you could provide someone with macro targets, or you could use macro targets, is by having them as percentages of your overall calorie intake. So for example, having 30% of your calories coming from protein, 50% from carbs, and 20% from fat to make up 100% of your calorie needs or calorie target. I still think, I think macro targets generally super appropriate as part of a well-designed nutrition plan, but there are several reasons why we wouldn't necessarily use ratios over specific number targets, and we're going to go through the reasons why we think that.
Yeah, so the easiest one is if we know the number target, why don't we just use the number target?
Yeah.
That's quite simple. Just being for example, if the research shows that 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram body weight protein per day is optimal for muscle growth, we could just go 1.6 times somebody's body weight and 2.2 and be like, this is your range or whatever. Where in that example, we know that 1.6 is probably enough to optimize things, but anything above that is just in case they're an outlier, or it allows you to go a bit over without going so high that it cuts into everything else. But we could give a number. We could be like, this person should target 180 grams of protein. It makes sense to use that range instead of a percentage, particularly because there's a lot of other things that could be skewed if you used a percentage.
Yeah, the big thing skewing your, when you're using percentages, the big thing that skews it is your overall energy needs, which can be skewed by level of activity. So a really great example to kind of highlight this is we take two people. We've got one person that is lifting 3 to 4 times per week. They're doing kind of an average of 5,000 steps per day and no cardio. So they're just mainly doing their resistance training and then doing maybe an office desk job for the rest of the day. And then compare that to person 2. So maybe they're training 5 to 6 times per week. So a little bit more. They're doing 12,000 steps per day because they work in retail or construction or something like that. And then they've also added in some cardio sessions for conditioning. In that example, those two people are going to have very different caloric needs, but they're going to have very similar protein needs. So they're still both wanting to kind of get between that 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo body weight protein target. But if we use percentages, let's say one person has a needs of 2,000 calories and one person has a need of 3,200 calories, and we used 20% of their calories coming from protein or 30% of their calories coming from protein, that would work out to be very different numbers as opposed to if we used a specific number target based on that range.
So if instead of doing percentages, what would we do instead? As I said, we'd do specific numbers. How do we find those specific numbers? The starting point is we'd figure out calorie needs. Then we can fit everything else into there. So many ways to figure out calorie needs. You could do a calorie calculator as a starting point, but I'm really big on just adjusting based on what happens. For example, if somebody wanted to maintain their weight, we'd use a calorie calculator to get a starting point, and then we see what happens. So we give them the amount of calories, and we see if they maintain their weight. If it goes up, we can reduce calorie intake. If it goes down, we can increase calorie intake. That's how we figure it out, assuming all variables remain equal, which they never will. I just want to keep it simple, right? So that we'd figure out calorie needs. Then we'd figure out protein needs. There's different ranges for that, that 1.6 to 2.2 number is what we'd use for somebody who's relatively lean, looking to go into a muscle gain phase. If somebody was looking to be in a calorie deficit but they had more body fat, we'd probably use fat-free mass as an indicator and go 2.3 to 3.1 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass. There's a bunch of different ranges, right? But we would use some form of formula for figuring out protein needs. Then we would figure out an appropriate range for fat. If somebody wasn't specifically trying to be on a low-carb diet or anything like that, I would use a range of, say, 0.5 to 1 gram per kilogram of body weight fat, just because going below the bottom end of that could have impacts on hormones. For example, in males, testosterone might decrease. And going above 1 just leaves less room for either carbohydrates and protein. That's probably the main thing. And there's no real additional benefit from a hormonal perspective or anything like that. So we'd figure out a protein target, we'd figure out a fat target. Then we'd fill out the rest of the calories with carbohydrates. This might seem confusing if you aren't deep down the macro rabbit hole, but the reason why I can just say just fill out the rest with carbohydrates is because calories are made up of macros. Protein has 4 calories per gram, carbs has 4 calories per gram, fat has 9 calories per gram. So by definition, if you have a calorie target, you have a protein target, and you have a fat target, there's only so many calories left over. You fill it out with carbohydrates. Taking this approach means that things scale well with activity. For example, if there's 2 people who are lifting weights, but one is significantly more active than the other one outside of the weight room, their calorie needs will be different, as you said, and they have relatively similar protein needs. We figure out their protein needs, we have a range for fat, and then we fill out the rest with carbohydrates. If we wanted to fill out some more of the calories with fat, we could just go higher up that range. If we wanted to fill out less, we can go lower down that range. And then the carbohydrates are the ones that really swing the most, where it's like if somebody's significantly more active than the other person, they get more carbohydrates than the other. In both cases, unless somebody's particularly low calorie, they won't end up in a low carb state or anything like that, because most people will have a decent kind of calorie and carbohydrate kind of budget. But if somebody's way more active, they'll end up with significantly more carbohydrates. This just works out way more accurately in a lot of cases than if you're using percentages, because if you're using percentages, often you have to justify why you're using percentages in some ways. Like you see people be like, this is a percentage you use if you're a hard gainer, and this is a percentage you use if you're like, and if we know the exact numbers, we can just use the exact numbers.
Yeah, and in a lot of circumstances outside of maybe athletes where you want to pay more attention to fat and carb ratio, sometimes just looking at overall calorie needs and then having a protein target is like enough for most people to nail things. And then you can kind of let fats and carbs fall where they may. So overall, it is much more effective to use macro targets or those specific kind of range numbers, such as like X grams of protein per kilo body weight, X grams of fat per kilo body weight, plus rest from carbs, like Aidan was saying. That seems way more effective than using a percentage of protein, fats, and carbs based on overall calorie consumption, since that can kind of swing in all different ways depending on overall calorie intake.
This has been episode 126 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. As always, if you could please leave a rating and review, that would be greatly appreciated.